Hey folks, it's Tika with Customer Support Department. I got asked to make a video on best fabrics for SCA Newbies, so here we go. The first thing that I did was run out and ransack my bookcase going, oh my gosh, let's make sure I'm right, let's not tell anyone wrong stuff. Found a couple of books, I was mostly right, found a couple of books I'm going to recommend to folks, but I'm just going to sort of run them by you so you can see what I'm using as resources. Viking Clothing by Thor, Ewing, I just ran through and made sure that he agreed with me that yes, linen and wool both existed for the Vikings, as did silk, but in much smaller quantities. Textiles and Clothing, 1550 to 1450. This is part of the Medieval Finds from Excavations in London series. This gets way into detail on what kinds of fabrics, what kinds of weaves, what kinds of everything they dug up in London that they can date back to in basically between that period. Again, they're telling me wool, linen, some silk. I'm gonna leave you to last. Tudor Tailor, if you're interested in sort of Tudor and Elizabethan, they've got a new book coming out real soon now called The Typical Tudor that deals with a lot more with lower class and middle and lower class people. This is mostly the royals and the upper class people, but they have an amazing table in here that basically takes you through, I think this one starts with linen, and I think drops you to wool, so linen, wool, silk, and sort of miscellaneous down at the bottom. And it tells you basically everything you could want to know about that type of fabric and the weave you could find it in this period. If you're Tudor or Elizabethan or later, get it, love it. My last one that I did sort of check through, because this one is kind of an interesting sort of bridge between, between Viking and later. Woven into the Earth, it's another archaeological sort of findings book from Norse Greenland. It's not sort of true Norse, but it's not sort of like true 11 to 1300 either. It's sort of an interesting like bridge between there, especially like up in the Scandinavians and like some Ireland and England. Again, if you're a big nerd, if you want to look at like how textiles were spun, how they were woven, good one to have. And the last one, again, we're going back to that sort of 1100 to 1480 time period. The Medieval Tailor's Assistant, who is great because she lays it out kind of all in like a couple of pages for you. Materials. And I saved her, again, she agrees with me. Wool, linen, silk, some cotton. We'll talk a little bit more about cotton. But I saved her to last because I wanted to read my favorite passage from this book for you. So here you go, dramatic readings with Customer Support Department. Most modern textiles are mass-produced for short life and low cost. From fiber sorting to dyeing, they are made by different processes and are usually much lighter than medieval cloths. There are no authentic fabrics, although some specialist mills come close. If you want good materials for regular use, be prepared to spend time and money. Very, 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 very true. I said, or I will say, I don't know if I've said it yet, but there are a couple of websites that I just kind of like haunt, looking for like remnants or like leftovers or like sales or anything like that. I'll try to go through my bookmarks and find all of the places that I check if I'm looking for something, and I'll leave them sort of down in the collection below with the books. The other thing that Sarah Thursfeld agrees with me on is her materials to avoid. Any knitted or t-shirt fabric, so anything that, you feel it and you're like, oh, that's a t-shirt, that's stretchy. Knit fabrics have little loops in them, so if you can see loops, don't do it. If you can see like straight back and forth, better. Avoid anything with big lumps in the spinning. I'll say that again when we get into silks. Avoid anything more whole than thread. So if you can see like right through it, not very authentic. Avoid shiny synthetics in place of silk. Most synthetics are plastic. You're gonna hate it. Polycotton and polyviscous. Again, those are polys, so they're plastic and you're gonna hate it. The cotton and the viscous just aren't period fabrics. I'm willing to fudge a little bit on that. We'll get to that again later. Avoid printed textiles unless you have a specific textile that is like this is perfect for this. This is an authentic pattern. This is, you know, as close to as I can get these days to something. So I'm willing to fudge again a little bit on printed textiles. She says avoid lurex metallic fabrics. So those are any of those like fancy, evening wear. I was gonna say bridal. I'm like, not really bridal, but any fancy evening wear things that are 100% plastic and have those sort of, like, if you know the Christmas tree tinsel, it looks like it's like woven with Christmas tree tinsel. That's lurex. Don't do it. It's plastic. Don't do it. And the final thing she says, and the thing that I agree with her most on, avoid furnishing textiles. A lot of people look at these and they're like, oh, it should be a big heavy fabric. It should be, you know, like something with some heft. Like, we're gonna go to the upholstery fabrics. Stay out of the upholstery section. Stay out of the upholstery section. Don't do it. Don't go in there. 90%, I was gonna say 95, but I'll take it down to 90. 90% of what you find in the upholstery fabric is not gonna go well. It's plastic, it's made to last with like butts and so forth on it, if you're talking like true upholstery, like couch fabric. It's backed in plastic sometimes, it can be waterproof. It's not something you want to put on your body because you're gonna sweat and you're gonna be like, why do I feel like I am just boiling in my own sweat? Because you're wearing upholstery fabric. The other thing with upholstery fabric is that it tends to be heavier than apparel fabric, which may be something that you think you want, you don't. If you stick with linen, if you stick with wool, it will look closer to art of the period. Upholstery fabric tends to, you know, like, tends to not drape. Well, obviously you'll see me drape a couple of fabrics up here in a minute or so, but it tends to not drape. So if I have a skirt and it comes out this way, in upholstery fabric, that's where it stays. Upholstery fabric is not gonna like fall nicely to the body and like flow. Upholstery fabric's gonna be like, yo, I'm a couch. Other fabrics, apparel fabrics, will sort of like flow over the body and it'll look a lot more like the people in the artwork that you're trying to. Avoid the home deck upholstery section. If you get nothing else from this, I'm gonna get like scarily close to make you look at my pimples, put eyeliner on for you. Stay out of the upholstery section. Don't do it. There are occasional times where it's like, all right, that's a good pattern, you might get away with it, but if you're a beginner, stay out of the upholstery section. Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. Now that I've beaten that horse to death, let's talk a little bit about fabrics, shall we? All right, so let's start out with sort of the first one that everyone pushes SCA Newbies to, which is linen, which there's a good reason for that. Linen was everywhere. Linen grew. The Vikings grew linen, the, like, medieval general Europe grew linen, the Egyptians wore linen. Pretty much, if you were around, you probably wore linen for something. European-wise, most of the linen was base layers, was body layers. So you'd wear like a linen shirt or a linen like long smock or something like that, put the rest of your clothes on over it, take the rest of your clothes off at the end of the day, and the smock would be the only thing that got washed. Remember, bathing was not a popular thing for most of this time period, unless you were a Viking and then it was. But bathing for a lot of Europe was not a thing that you did that often, because like, it's going to throw your humors out of whack. So you wanted a layer that would let you wash it so that it was sort of the barrier between you and your grossness and your fancy stuff. So everyone wore linen. This is a fabrics-store.com ILO9 linen. This is sort of the general SCA, everyone wears this linen. This is linen natural color, so it hasn't been bleached, hasn't been dyed. This is what it's gonna look like. Linen is from a plant, it is the flax plant, and it's sort of destructed, it's sort of broken down to turn into fiber, to spin, to weave. So this is basically what that process ends with. I believe at fabricstore.com it's usually $10 or $11 a yard. You can find it on sale. They'll do sales where they put like one linen on sale. You can get it down to $9 a yard, which is essentially what a good cotton is going to cost you. Get the linen instead. And it comes in a bunch of different weights. So this, like I said, is the ILO9 from fabricstore.com. I don't remember the number designation on this one that they use, but this is their sort of lighter weight linen. You can almost sort of see me through it. This is what I use if I'm doing veils or something like that. The last one, this is like if I'm doing tunics or dresses or something. Most of the coat hardies that I've got that are linen is this weight. This is veils, ruffs, sort of finer things like partlets. If you've got something that needs to be linen but not quite as like sturdy. If you need sturdy, you're going to want to start looking at linen canvas. So this is a linen canvas. I believe this one is probably from William Booth Draper, because I recognize this as part of my master's thesis, and I know I got most of my linens from them. William Booth Draper and Burnley and Trowbridge are both post-our period sutlers. They deal mostly sort of colonial and beyond, so like 1700 and on, but they do a lot of linens and wools and so forth that we can kind of like yank and drag back into the SCA period. So that's a light linen canvas. I know I made pants out of this. And if you are a fighter, either rapier or heavy, linen canvas, if someone says linen canvas, this is what you're looking for. I found this at a place in Dallas. I used it for the interlining of a Tudor dress to sort of just give myself, I pad stitch it in and like use this to do the stiffener on it. But this is if you need to do gambesons, if you need to put a layer in for rapier to pass a punch test, linen canvas is what you're looking for if you want to be authentic. You can get away with cotton canvas on the inside, linen on the outside if you want to look more period. Make sure you pre-wash everything before you sew it, otherwise your cotton and your linen will shrink at different rates and you will suddenly have the great wrinkly weirdo gambeson of doom. I've seen many of them. So that's linen. Linen on a burn test. So one of the ways that you check to see what fabric you've got is you can burn it, and it has a sort of different properties for each. Linen on a burn test is going to smell like wood or paper because it's a cellulosic fiber. So if you just torch this, it's going to sort of light extinguish itself. It'll smell like burning paper, and it'll have just like a little bit of really soft black ash. One of the other ways that if I walk into a fabric store and I'm like, I don't know if I believe that that's linen. Another way that I'll check is I'll breathe on my hand to try to get some sort of like heat and moisture. And then I'll crumple it sort of into that and hold on to it for a second. If it comes out and it gives you that sort of, I've been sitting on a linen suit reaction, so if it sort of like keeps the crumples, there's a good chance you've got something that's at least partially linen. Linen blends that I don't object to, they aren't period, but I don't object to them. Linen and rayon, and linen and cotton. Cotton we'll get to is sort of a like vaguely period fiber. Rayon is a weirdo because it is a man-made natural fiber. And you're like, what the heck? Rayon, I believe, appeared, I want to say World War I-ish. And it is actually sort of cellulose fiber, so like tree fiber, ground up, sort of mushed up into a mush, and then extruded into like a textile fiber. So if you've ever made paper, that sort of paper mush you start with to like scoop out and just put away, they've processed that in a way that comes out in long threads that can then be woven. So technically rayon is both a natural fiber and a man-made fiber. I know there are a lot of rayon linen blends. If you can't afford linen, those tend to be slightly cheaper. Not always, like do your due diligence and like check to see. But those are sort of less awful. A linen rayon blend is not quite as good as a real linen, but will be significantly better than the 100% plastic thing that looks like linen. Because part of this game is that linen, especially when worn with wool, sort of acts as a pre-1900, pre-1980 sort of wick-away fabric. So the linen sort of grabs the sweat from your body, and then sort of the wool will like let it out into the air. There's a reason people were wearing linen and wool together for years before we got to any fancy like technical fabrics or anything. So linen and wool actually surprisingly good together. That being said, let's move on to wool. Dump the linen pile. All right, so wools obviously come from sheep, come from other animals. Usually have different names if they come from other animals, but things like wool come from animals. Anywhere you have sheep, you can have wool. Anywhere you don't have sheep, probably not going to have wool. Anywhere that's warm probably has wool. Again, anywhere that's warm probably doesn't wear as much wool, but may have it. Anywhere that's cool probably figured out wool. This is also sort of where fur comes in. In Europe, when we were doing that sort of mini ice age, there's a lot of wool lined in fur. So like completely fur-lined dresses. So we're probably not doing that these days because it's global warming. But keep that in mind that like back then it was like layers and layers and layers and layers and layers to keep warm in your big drafty castle with no central heating. So this is a reasonably period accurate wool. This one is probably even a little light. This is a wool flannel, and you can see sort of how it, let me grab it from the middle, how it wants to drape. So you can see how that would make sort of a nice skirt, a nice coat hardy for a man or a woman, or a nice skirt attached to a Tudor kirtle. Wool flannel, this one's not too heavy, like I can see light through it as I put it up there. This one has been fulled, which is the process very much like felting. So you can see the difference. This is a fold, so it sort of locks the fibers in together. This is felt. This one still moves. This one does not. This is a hat blank that I'm gonna make into something someday. If you've seen Outlander, and I haven't, don't come for me. I don't especially want to see it, because don't get me started on the costumes. But I know in Outlander, in one of the first episodes when she gets to Scotland, there's a group of women sitting around sort of outside a house around a table, and they're sort of tossing wool back and forth to each other and singing. They are doing what's called walking, W-A-U-L-K-I-N-G, walking the wool, and they are actually, it's doused in urine, as gross as that is, and they are fulling it so that the fibers stay together. Sadly, none of the wool these days is as great as it used to be. You can see on this, I'm starting to get sort of little fibery ends here. Back in the day, these would have been fulled better and woven tighter. So when you see like Lance Connect guys that are wearing wool and they have all of the little cutouts in them, they didn't have to finish the edges. They could just cut it and go. It was in a lot of ways, a lot closer to the felt I just showed you. So cotton flannel, no idea where I got this one. My bet is it's a fabric store near my parents' house in Oregon. This is a slightly thicker wool. This is not a wool flannel. This is sort of fulled on one side and not on the other, so you can see the weave here. This, I believe, was fashionfabricsclub.com. This might have been Fabric Mart Fabrics. Fashionfabricsclub.com and Fabric Mart Fabrics are the two that I sort of like camp on and like wait for something great to go on sale. They tend to be sort of remnant places, so they get kind of other people's leftovers. I want to say this was $10 or $12 a yard, and I've used it as a Norse apron dress. So again, slightly different style of wool. One of the things I notice with both of these wool is that they are sort of slightly fuzzy. That's pretty common at this time. If you start looking at suitings online, suitings tend to be very modern and very shiny. So they're sort of processed and then like ironed to be reasonably shiny. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So like be careful if you find something that says it's a wool suiting. It may not actually be sort of nicely fuzzy and what you want. Is that wool? That's wool. So wool, when you do a burn test, is going to smell like burning hair, and is going to sort of make little balls of ash that if you try to like pinch it, it will crush. Or if you try to like sweep it away, it will just sort of smear. Smells like hair, little balls of ash. Wool is actually also one of the most often blended things, and it's one of the things that I am sort of most willing to let go as a blend. A wool poly blend might be $12 a yard. A wool is probably gonna be closer to 20. So I'm willing to, for the sake of my budget, willing to sort of let that go a little. One of the things that I check though is what percent is wool and what percent is poly. Usually on a website it'll say like 70% wool, 30% poly. I tend not to go below 75% because then when you start reaching that like polyester wool equilibrium, you start getting to the now I'm wearing plastic and I'm sweating thing. Places to look for wool, again, Fabric Mart Fabrics, fashionfabricsclub.com. I think like the big one for most reenactors, if you're looking for a specific 100% wool color, is Dorr Mill, D-O-R-R Mill. If you want to go like really high quality, really amazing, like you might actually be able to make your lands connect with its cutouts without finishing them, Pendleton Woolen Mills. Woolrich Woolen Mills used to also do sales to the public. I think at this point they've stopped. I think they may only do wholesale, but they may also just not be selling fabric anymore at all. Wool fabric is one to check if you find it used. Just hold it up and make sure that you don't have like little holes all over it. Moths eat wool. That's why we've got mothballs, that's why we've got cedar, that's why we've got that. The nice thing though is that if you find, you know, like estate sale wool and it doesn't have holes in it, it holds up pretty well. Like wool doesn't tend to get, you know, weird in any way. Just it may be smelly when you iron it, but that'll be it. So wool, ta-da. And our last guy, let's talk some about silk. So silk, originally from China, made by worms, silkworms. If you're interested in sericulture, which is sort of the care, feeding, raising, and harvesting of silk from silkworms, get in touch with Countess, I'm trying to get the title right, Countess Serena of the Mid-Realm. Her laurel was actually for sericulture, so she has raised her own silkworms and harvested her own silk, and it's fascinating. Silk originally from China, started making its way sort of down, sort of through the Middle East and back up into Europe on the Silk Road. So we were starting to get it into Europe prior to 1300. By 1300, the story that I've heard is that a couple of guys went to China. Honestly, I don't know who they were. This was sort of like the story as I remember it. But they stuffed silkworms down in a walking stick and sort of left China, and they were like, nope, nothing to see here, and got back to Europe and started raising their own silkworms. The silk industry was really big in Italy. Obviously, like, from there it spread, silk became a thing. If you go back to sort of the early, I had said, like, stuff had generally come from China and down, and had also silk was also into sort of Russia, and the Byzantine Empire early on, and the Vikings had silk. Not much. A lot of it looks like they had sort of, you know, like run into a church and gone, hey, that's pretty, I'm taking it, taken the altar cloth, and sort of cut it up however they felt like it. So a lot of the Byzantine silk would have, like, not mandalas, but sort of roundels with, like, imagery in it. And you find it on Viking clothes and Viking graves, just sort of cut up into strips, kind of like, it's fancy and I'm wearing it, but I don't care that was supposed to be a horse. If you're interested in that, there is a whole book called Silk for the Vikings that sort of talks about, like, how it got there and all of that. So silk, generally a high-class fabric. Don't wear it if you're Joe the Peasant. I don't wear much silk because it makes me sweat. It holds heat in really well. And even with a linen layer under it, like, I am a sweaty, sweaty girl and just don't want to deal with that. Most silks also water stain or water spot, so if you sweat in them, like, you're gonna have sort of the, like, look I sweated here mark until you wash it, or at least, like, dip it in the water and water stain all of it. So I personally don't use much silk for anything but sort of fancy trims. I'm also a Viking, so you know. But silk looks like this. I got this to do the trim on a Viking coat. It's not patterned, but it was sort of, it color matched pretty well. Again, I haven't ironed it, so I'm trying to pull it out for you there. I believe when I bought this, it was labeled silk taffeta. That's generally what you want to look for, because back in the day, I told you I'd get back to this. Back in the day, this sort of smooth finish is what you wanted. Today, folks like silk du peony, and this is a silk du peony that I just had a hunk of because I was using for something else, and you can see, especially sort of through here, past the wrinkles, that there are these sort of like slubby bits in it. These days we look at that and we're like, oh, it's like artisan, someone made that. But back in the day it would be like, there's Joe and his cheap silk doublet. So don't get a du peony unless you can see it. Some du peonies have fewer slubs than others, so sometimes you can get away with using a du peony, but especially if you're buying online, I wouldn't necessarily trust it. If you can see it, great. If you can't, don't bother. Online, you're generally looking for a silk taffeta. That's what you want. That's the kind of weave you want. Places I buy silk online, again, I don't wear that much silk, so I don't buy that much silk. Places I will get, again, look at the discount places. Look at Fabric Mart Fabrics. Look at Fashion Fabrics Club. I think it's Fashion Fabrics Club. Might be both. One of them generally has a fair amount of silk taffeta. It may be in horrible colors, but they tend to have a fair amount of it. I know some SCA folks use Silk Baron a lot. I haven't tried them yet. Theater costuming wise, exotic silks and Thai silks, but they are definitely sort of like, they're pricey, but they're good. And the big one that the reenactors really love, especially if you're looking for pattern silk, is Sartor, S-A-R-T-O-R, and that's sartor.cz. They're in the Czech Republic. And I know that in the US, the Harpy and the Hag, who is an SCA merchant, sells a lot of their stuff. So it's worth talking to her if you want their stuff, because it won't cost as much for her to import as it will for you, because she's doing it in bigger quantities. The other thing in silk that I wanted to sort of show people was silk velvet, and again, sadly, this looks like crushed velvet because it's been in the bin. But this is a silk rayon velvet. This is sort of the cost-effective way of getting the silk velvet idea. Because silk velvets were like the thing, especially like cutwork silk velvets, the thing. This is a silk rayon. I believe that the pile here is the rayon and the backing here is the silk. This you can find modernly. I'm not going to say it's cheap. I want to say it's like $17 to $22 a yard. But if you compare that with 100% silk pile, silk backing, it's like $200 a yard. So silk velvet, silk rayon blend is another one of those places where I'm like, cost-wise, we're gonna let it go. So those are pretty much the big three fabrics. The other couple that I wanted to touch on were cotton, which if you think about if you're in America, think about where cotton is grown. It's down in the South where it's warm. So warm places grow cotton. Back in the medieval period, I know Greeks and Romans were wearing a lot of cotton. A lot of cotton was grown in India. When it first got up to sort of Europe, people were kind of like, great, whatever. And they'd take the cotton bolls and just use them to like stuff mattresses and like use them for padding and so forth. Sort of wool could be processed into thread, but like this stuff, we're just gonna stuff it in there. When it started being processed and started being processed into fabric, a lot of cotton was like kerchiefs and so forth. There was something else that I remember. A lot of it went up into sort of Holland, into the Low Countries, and became sort of like big collars and things like that too. So cotton was sort of a, look what I've got in my like kerchief and so forth, I'm a fancy boy. So cotton did exist. A lot of times cotton was actually being woven with linen to get fustian. I was like, it's either fustian or linsey woolsey, but fustian is linen weft cotton, no, linen warp cotton weft. So it's basically like one set of threads going one way is linen, one going the other way is cotton. And that was sort of sturdy fabric that was like a utility fabric. Another utility fabric that folks ran into a lot was ramie, which is nettles, sort of processed the same way as linen, and hemp processed similarly to linen, and they were sort of like utility fabrics. So you'd have an apron, or you'd have, you know, a mattress, or you'd have a ship sail made out of hemp or ramie or something like that, so we didn't waste the good linen on something else. I think the other thing people wanted me to talk about was patterns and sort of how to see patterns. That sort of harkens back to the beginning of this where I said, get your books out. Seeing period patterns comes a lot from staring at period patterns. One of the things that I tell people is Pinterest is an okay source as long as you use it like Wikipedia. So as long as you double check everything you're seeing. If you're looking at period images, make sure you know who drew them and where and when they're from. Hans Holbein is a name, like everyone who does sort of later period is like, Hans Holbein, he does a lot of great imagery of people wearing clothes. Don't trust a pre-Raphaelite. There are a lot of those like really popular, like Ophelia in the lake, and like the woman like going up the stairs with the knight like holding onto her hand. Those were done in like the 1870s, 1880s. They didn't know what they looked like. As a costumer, if you look at those, you can see like, oh, those ladies are wearing underwear of the 1880s underneath it. Don't trust a pre-Raphaelite. Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. Find a museum with some stuff that you like, or like back at Google image search stuff into museums. The Victoria and Albert in England has a lot of good like actual fashion stuff and a lot of good like imagery. The MFA in Boston actually has a lot of good stuff online. The Kyoto Costume Institute, or the Kyoto Institute, their costume half has a lot of good stuff online. So don't just like Pinterest it and be like, oh, this showed up, so that labeled this way, so that must be right. Backtrack it into a museum, or backtrack it to an actual source that isn't like Joe's Poster Depot, and look at them there. I think that's about it. If anyone has questions, feel free to drop them in the comments, or like find me on Facebook. If there's anything anyone wants me to cover more in depth, feel free to let me know. If you want to drop me like $2 or $3 for standing here and talking to a camera for half an hour, I'll leave my like Ko-Fi down below. Otherwise, happy sewing from Costumer Support Department. Good luck. Whoops, I'm back for a second because I realized I forgot to tell you what silk burn tested like. So silk in a burn test will smell, again, like hair, but will sort of turn into this like gritty, grody ash. As you're burn testing, if anything you burn test turns into sort of a little plastic nubbiny ball, it's plastic. If you touch it and it like does sort of like stringy things to you and you burn yourself, plastic. Basically anything that doesn't ash has at least some polyester, some plastic in there. If you can't tell, it's probably plastic. For real this time. Happy sewing, good luck.